To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod.
Welcome to the Death Panel. Patrons, thank you so much for supporting the show. None of the work that we do would be possible without you. To become a supporter of the show and get access to the second weekly bonus episode, as well as the entire back catalog of bonus episodes, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. And to help us out some more, share the show with your friends, post about your favorite episodes, pick up copies of Health Communism, A Short History of Trans Misogyny, and Abolish Rent at your local bookstore, or request them at your local library and follow us at deathpanel_. I'm Beatrice Adler-Bolton, and I'm really honored to be here today with our guest, Nafis Hasan. Nafis is an author and organizer. He has his PhD in cell, molecular, and developmental biology. His postdoctoral research at Tufts focused on developing 3D models to study brain tumors, and his graduate research was in breast cancer. He is currently an associate faculty at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research and serves as an editor for the radical science magazine Science for the People and South Asian left media platform Jamhor. I've asked Nafis on the show today to discuss his recent book called Metastasis, The Rise of the Cancer Industrial Complex and the Horizons of Care, which was published by Common Notions Press in February 2025. Nafis, welcome to the Death Panel. It's so great to have you on the show.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
I'm really just so glad to have you here with us today. Your book, Metastasis, The Rise of the Cancer Industrial Complex and the Horizon of Care, is really a fantastic book. It's a remarkable and very urgent contribution to how we understand not just cancer, but also the political economy of health under capitalism. It's a sweeping analysis of how cancer has been weaponized as a site of profit extraction, how science has been bent to serve capital, or rather how it's developed in concert with capital, and how the very structures of claiming to quote unquote fight cancer or the war on cancer instead ensure its persistence. Now, across the book's chapters, you trace the history of the cancer industrial complex from the dominance of genetic theories of cancer, which crowd out and downplay environmental theories that demand both prevention and a whole health approach, to the historically materialist context of the astronomical pricing of cancer pharmaceuticals, to neoliberal ideologies and policies that turn cancer into an individualized burden. You also point us towards a vision of care that's grounded in solidarity, collective struggle, and a science unshackled from capital. So for listeners of Death Panel, this book sits right at the heart of what we try and always make legible on this show, that health and illness cannot be separated from the economic and political systems that produce them. And cancer is a very specific terrain of struggle where capital feeds on our vulnerability and turns suffering into revenue. There's political and economic conditions of care here that are just as deadly and toxic as the disease itself. And Metastasis insists that if we want to talk about how to help people with cancer, we can't just stop at the level of medicine and pharmaceuticals. We have to confront the social order and the political order that generates both the disease and its commodified cures. So, Nafis, your book shows with very sharp clarity how capitalism also metastasizes through our own bodies, through science, through politics, and refuses to leave the reader with a sense of despair. You're always returning to the possibility of building medicine and politics organized around liberation, rather than just accumulation and extractive abandonment. As you write in the final chapter called The Horizon, quote, "Why are we still losing our loved ones to cancer after decades of trumpeting imminent victory? Cancer remains an incalcitrant enemy that strikes mercilessly, ripping families apart and leaving behind emotional, physical, social, and financial scars. As the death toll steadily climbs, no new developments turn the tide of the war. Expensive new drugs barely make a dent against the death march. The solution offered remains the same. The war must continue," end quote. And then a few pages later, you continue, quote, "The cancer industrial complex operates on many layers, so dismantling it will require thousands of struggles. We must begin by dismantling the core, challenging the theoretical foundations of cancer biology and life sciences itself, and scientists must reclaim their labor in the knowledge production process," end quote. Now, I really love this book. I'm so excited to talk about it today. And I'd love to sort of just start by grounding it for listeners who haven't had a chance to read the book yet, and asking you to share basically what pushed you to write the book and how you see the fight against cancer linking to the larger struggle against capitalism itself. You bring a very unique perspective as someone who has the science background, who's also an organizer. And how did those experiences essentially sort of shape what became the argument for Metastasis? I'm curious if you would just sort of walk listeners through what you think is most important for people to understand about cancer, not as a medical or scientific problem, but as a political problem?
Yeah, thank you. I would just like to say I'm really happy to be here because Death Panel and your book, Health Communism, has also really influenced my thinking as I was writing the book. And I think readers will find that very evident, especially towards the end. I was the biology major in college and I did my undergrad work on breast cancer because my aunt who lived with us, my father's sister, she lived with us and she, had a very tragic death. She was diagnosed with ovarian cancer that metastasized and that had a big influence on me. So I decided to study cancer biology and I found a professor who was working on breast cancer in college. So I did my undergrad with him. And then I worked at a breast cancer lab as a technician at Thomas Jefferson University in Philly. And at Jefferson is really when I started going to seminars and hearing clinicians speak about their results in the clinics versus basic scientists talking about their advances or discoveries in the lab. And it was kind of becoming clear that, sure, we are learning a lot about cancer. We have all these new leads on new drug targets or ways to figure out, how do we better handle cancer? But then the clinicians were sort of giving a more grim view, saying that, we're not really seeing much improvement, whether it's survival versus tumor reduction. But I think the overall sentiment has always been that, okay, whatever improvement, even if it's marginal, is better than not having that improvement. So in graduate school, I went to the Tufts University's, what's now called the Graduate School of Biomedical Sciences. It used to be called the Sackler School, but after, in 2018, they actually changed the name. Well, after a lot of pressure, obviously, for 2019, I would say, they changed the name to Graduate School of Biomedical Sciences. So I did my undergrad study under Ana Soto and Carlos Sonnenschein. And I chose Ana and Carlos because they really challenged the notion or that we had that I had actually never sort of thought about is that they have this theory about carcinogenesis or how cancer is caused, which is very different from what we learn in textbooks or in college or even in grad school. So the idea generally that we are fed is cancer is a genetic disease, that it's a disease that's caused by changes in your genes called mutations, and that results in a cell becoming rogue and then growing out of control, and that's how cancer starts. But Ana and Carlos have spent decades sort of showing or trying to, providing evidence that that may not be the case, and they have advanced a theory called the tissue organization field theory, and we can talk more about the theoretical aspect a little later, but I'm grounding this because I think that sort of idea kind of became attractive to me because it sort of provided a way to understand why the current approach to cancer treatment was not working, at least for me, right? And I'm working, this is in 2014. And then in 2018, I was in a graduate course on ethics. And a big question that came up for my cohort at that time was, are cancer drug prices justified? Because that was the year that Novartis released a cancer therapy that cost $500,000. And they had gotten it approved for childhood leukemias. But it was $500,000. And there was this big uproar, even doctors were writing in the New York Times saying that this is indefensible pricing. And that sort of became a question in the class. And I remember one of my classmates really, very vocally defending that price. And they were saying that, pharmaceutical companies spend so much time doing R&D, but we know that a lot of R&D is funded by the government, right? It's public money. So it got me really worked up to the point where I kind of spent a couple of sleepless nights out of spite to write this unedited Medium piece called The Cancer Industrial Complex. Because one, I started reading about okay, why are cancer prices so high, right? And then you start digging, and then you start finding all these things about oh, the prices are high because there is no actual logical mechanism. It's just because prices have been high, you can just peg the new cancer drug to that price as its launch price, right? Then you find out that launch prices are the only way pharmaceutical companies can make money off of them because after they enjoy 7 to 10 years of exclusivity, right? The patent on the drug then expires. But then it doesn't stop there because pharmaceutical companies are somehow always getting their patents extended, or they're doing backroom deals, or they're buying out competitors to push off any sort of generics coming in. And it's also 2018 is the time when this new phenomenon was being described in academic papers, more not necessarily cancer biology papers, but more like social studies papers that were looking at something called, which is now called financial toxicity, which is the idea that cancer patients throughout their lifetime actually, the cost of cancer treatment and associated costs on their families, like losing a job or not having health insurance or not having access to medicine, actually increases the risk of dying, which is this, big paradox, is that we're telling people that yes, we have all these great treatments. Look at the scientific progress we've made, but people are dying because they are, going broke paying for these treatments, right? Like, and that's really causing them to die. And I think, that's how I ended up writing the book, because I did feel that there was something that needed to be said about this, because cancer is the second cause of disease-related mortality in the United States. The first is cardiovascular diseases, but cancer is also a very social and political phenomenon, because unfortunately, in our lifetime, we all are going to know one person who is going to suffer from one kind of cancer, right? And it's so prevalent in our society. And the fact that there's a whole war against it for like more than 50 years, and we're not really seeing much changes. And I wanted to sort of explore that connection between like, okay, and being a scientist myself, I will say that, we are always taught that the scientific method corrects itself, right? So you have a theory and you test it. You have a hypothesis, you test it, and then using the data and the interpretation, you either create a theory or like you defend it, right? Or you reject it, right? And that's the scientific method, which is self-correcting. But then why it didn't all these years of failure self-correct the idea that, hey, maybe instead of looking into the genes, why don't we take a look elsewhere? And then when I looked into the history of cancer research, it said like, yeah, at some point, there were all these other ideas about like what caused cancer, but they all got drowned out, not because this theory was particularly so great or like, so, how do I say, like, so, like it couldn't be rejected. But I think that does not answer the whole question, because science is not isolated, or, scientific research is not isolated from the rest of society, right? Scientists are members of society. How the process of what science gets funded is political, right? As we are all learning right now, in the worst way possible. But like also science itself is a political process, which scientists in the United States especially have rejected for a long time, which is like a holdover from the Cold War and anti-communist era, right? So I think like sort of going into that, I wanted to explore the political and the social forces that gave rise to the hegemony of this idea that cancer is caused by genes. And then based on that idea, like we are producing all these drugs, but then who does it serve, right? Like who is making money off of it, and like who is benefiting from it? And like, are these drugs actually beneficial for the patients? And of course, who is bearing the cost of whether the research, whether the ultimate failure of the drugs, or like the marginal utility of the drugs, and like how do we fix it in some way? And I will be upfront and say that the book does not have one solution. It obviously offers some prescriptions, but it does not have like one particular thing that says, yeah, this is how you're going to solve it.
There's no magic bullet.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Yes. Yeah. So one thing, obviously, even though it has a few prescriptions, right, and one of them is pretty simple, right? It's like people have talked about this a lot, is that we need universal healthcare. The healthcare landscape in the United States is atrocious, to say the least. People are tied to their employers, but also even the government programs are, even if they're marginally better than the employer offered ones, they're not that great, right? So if we truly want to, quote unquote, win the war on cancer, or actually help cancer patients, one of the easiest way to do that would be to provide everybody universal healthcare coverage, right? But that's a little separate from like, okay, so everybody has healthcare, everybody has access to healthcare, but then what do we do about the prices of cancer drugs? The answer, again, it already exists in other countries, right? There should be, price controls in place. And this is such an obvious thing that even the current administration is sort of like aiming at that, is like, yeah, everybody agrees on, across the political spectrum that drug prices are too high in the United States as opposed to like Canada or Mexico or UK or the EU, right? So I think there's very easy things that can be done so that pharmaceutical companies just can't keep price gouging. And when they do, hold them accountable and not just give them a pass, right? But also those are just sort of like surface level prescriptions that would, offer people some offer people some relief, right? But I think on the larger scale, we do have to think about like the whole production process. Like, do we necessarily want pharmaceutical production process in the hands of private companies? Because if you think about it, in the book, I argued that, pharmaceutical companies are kind of double dipping. Is like, one, they're offloading risks of research and development onto the public because they are using public dollars to carry out most of the R&D. For example, if you look at like how the biotech sector works right now, a lot of the initial stages of research happens in universities, which are majority of them are publicly funded from the NIH, the NCI, et cetera, right? But then when it comes to, let's say you move on to clinical trials, the clinical trials are also public-private collaborations. The NIH funds a lot of the clinical trials. But then at the end of the day, is the NIH getting the money back from them, right? Is the public getting the money back from them? The answer is no, because when the drug goes to market, the pharmaceutical companies who have bemoaned the high cost of like R&D and clinical trials, et cetera, are now not raking in all the cash. And the people who are paying for it is, one, the government for people who are on Medicare, or the consumers themselves, right? Like, so you're offloading risks onto the public. You're using the public money to develop your drugs. You're raking in all the profits, and you're making money off of like sick people and their families and the government, right? So I think that's where we have to sort of question this model of like privately owned production. And people might balk at it and be like, well, who is going to be producing these drugs? I think there could be state-mandated institutions, right? Like, and it's not unheard of. For example, Brazil, Cuba, and some other countries in Latin America have already done that. State-owned manufacturers actually produce all the drugs, and it's not that difficult to like imagine that sort of thing. Because if you think about the polio vaccine, right, one of the biggest public health breakthroughs in the United States and the world, it was funded by the public and produced by the public and distributed by the public, right? And there was a real big chance to do that when the COVID vaccine had come out in early stages, right? Like that whole Operation Warp Speed could have been a fully funded public project, but instead the government decided to like fund Moderna to do the thing that the government could have done, right? Because that's where we are at, is like we have so much faith, or naively put so much faith in like the public-private collaboration, like that's held up as this, that is what's going to save us, like whether it's cancer or whether it's climate crisis, right? Like that's the idea that generally liberals run towards, right? Is like, okay, we must have public-private collaboration, right? Like nobody's really thinking, what if we just like enterprise that we have done historically to solve these big issues, right? The other thing is, as a scientist, we work within universities and obviously at academic institutions. So a big part of it is that like science has become clear through the Gaza genocide, or even before that, is like, who is this scientific process serving, right? And you look at like where universities are invested. And I think, since the 80s, the new liberalization of academia has sort of resulted in universities acting more as hedge fund managers as opposed to like sites of knowledge production, right? And that's been a tension, because now when you walk into a lab, you're expected to become an entrepreneur, right? So that's how the biotech industry was set up, is like every single principal investigator of a lab is a potential entrepreneur, because they're going to spin off a company off of their lab. But at the end of the day, it becomes this situation where, yeah, sure, you have a drug candidate, you spin off a company from your lab, and the company gets bought out by a bigger pharmaceutical, and that's the end of that, right? And that's the cycle that we're seeing. So where does it leave the patients, right? And I think, universities acting as hedge fund managers, is that really a good model? And what would it mean for science to be democratized? And I think here I take lessons from Science for the People, who was a radical organization that existed in the 70s and now have revived again in mid 2010s, where they sort of have proposed models of like, how does it look like for science to serve the public good and not a profit motive, right? And I think all of those things, when we talk about it, the underlying theory or the underlying idea there is that like we have to confront capitalism, and because capitalism is so insidiously, wrapped up in all of these processes, right? Like, and this is where, towards the end of the book, I talk about the notion, what Marx had called subsumption, right? Is like it takes in everything under it, like it infiltrates everything, just as a tumor in the body biologically does, right? It subverts the biological processes, and capitalism sort of does the same thing within the production process. And whether it's knowledge production or whether it's like pharmaceutical production, right? It kind of embeds itself in everything. And so, like, in order to make any of these large-scale changes, we have to confront the power of capitalism.
To hear the full episode, Become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. You'll get access to this and the rest of our catalog of patron-only episodes, and be the first to get a new patron episode every Monday when it drops. With love, the Death Panel.